Tell you some of my story, and I've got to say that this is not an easy thing for me to do. It's a very big part of my story, this question of guilt or grace, and I'm already getting emotional just thinking about it. This part of my story is not something that I've told many people, maybe four. And so when this topic came up, and we were asked which Sunday we would be speaking about, I really didn't want tonight. But given the subject, I felt compelled to actually share this part of my story. So I became a Christian when I was 16. I grew up in a Christian household. My father was a preacher, and while I knew about the Bible and I knew about God and about Jesus, but it wasn't until I was 16 that I knew that Jesus was part of my life, that he became real for me. And it was a major step in my life, obviously. It was very compelling for me. It was a time when I was questioning what kind of person I would be. And through that process, I was going through all sorts of issues, including nightmares. And I asked God to make a difference. And he did. He answered my prayer. And so when God works in your life in that way, when he changes what's going on in your life, you know that he is real. There was no disputing it for me. There was no doubt. And to this day, I've had no doubt that God is real, that he cares about me and is active in my life. So turning 16, it's a change period for many of us in our lives, and it was for me as well. Everything was going well spiritually. I was in a church, I was being active in the church, and that was a good thing, part of community, part of church family. But unfortunately, in this church, in Melbourne at the time, there was a cult. As you can see, it's a very emotional thing for me to be talking about. This cult was pretty manipulative, and they were pretty smart. They were switched on people, and they would take young people my age who showed promise, and they would say, come and join us, and you can be sort of like on the fast track for spiritual leadership, and you can take a leadership role in the church, and we'll work in your life, and we'll help you to become all you can be, which is a good thing, right? But unfortunately, it wasn't all a good thing. It was a good presentation, but the way they acted was as a cult. And what a cult does is it isolates people and tries to control people, and that's what this group was doing. At the time, the church I was in, the pastor, who was a really good guy, died, and that left a bit of a vacuum. And my father was asked to be an interim pastor in this church, which he accepted to do. Unfortunately for him, at the same time, the cult saw this as an opportunity to take over the church. And so there was conflict. And that conflict was really underhanded. My father was a pretty simple guy, pretty blunt sort of guy, and he wasn't equipped to deal with that conflict. And it really hurt him. It damaged his health. And he wasn't the same after that. So I was about 17, 18 at that time. And I was involved in this cult. And I had to think about what is right, what's really going on here. And I challenged them. And their answer was, well, your dad's not all that he's cracked up to be. You know, it's probably his own fault. I left the church. There were a bunch of other things going on that they were doing, which were controlling and underhanded. And I saw what was happening in this church. And I thought, well, if this is church, I don't want any part of it. And so I started living for myself. I still believed that God was real. I didn't change my mind on that, but I wasn't living for Jesus, and I wasn't part of a church community because of the hurt that had happened. And so I was living a life like many other people. I was having a great time. I was in a cycling club, I was skiing, I was sailing, work. That was my life. And everything was going wonderfully well, but my dad wasn't. And I decided to leave Australia and started my overseas experience, my OE, and ended up in London, still living for myself. And my life was spiraling down. So we heard the story of the prodigal son, or the prodigal father with the wayward son, and that was me. And I know that others of us in this room can relate to that story as well. And by the time I came to my senses, like that son did in the story, I was drinking to excess 6 days a week. I was living with a woman who was married, but not to me. It's a mess. But I did come to my senses, fortunately, and chose to go back to church. Which leads us to the theme that we've got for tonight. Are we motivated by guilt or by grace? So with all these things going on in my life that have been going on for 10 years, I've been living for myself and getting into a bigger and bigger mess. So I've made the decision to be a Christian, to follow Jesus. I'm meant to be a new creation, but I wasn't living that way. How do you get back from that? How does God deal with us in these situations? Do we think that God is going to bring the sledgehammer down and sort us out, dealing with all these problems that we have? Or is God, in His grace, going to deal with us differently? And I've got to tell you, it's the second one of those. It's God's kindness that brings us to repentance. So I came back to church. Within a week, I met Vicky. What a turnaround. From being in a total relationship mess to having a real relationship. Only God does that. Turned it around. I've been carrying this thought that I was part of my father's ill health and then he died. It wasn't true that I was part of that causing it. But when we're younger, we think the world revolves around us and everything is either caused by us or caused for us. And then we hold on to these things and they start to eat away at us. And that's what was happening to me. And that's why this is so hard to talk about. But God in His kindness surrounded me with Christians. He enabled me to confess, to take away the pain, take away the sense of guilt. Even if you look at it objectively, that it shouldn't have been there, but it was. God was kind to me. He brought me back to Him. I've always cared about the church, but from my experience as a teenager, where I walked away from the church in disgust, God in His kindness has enabled me to work at the church, to stand here, to be a church pastor, to work with Howard and Lynette and Love Your Neighbour, and to help churches be who they can be. And it's only through His kindness that has been possible. If God had chosen to deal with me as I deserved, then I would be pushed down and pushed away, because I'd walked away and chosen to live for myself, and chosen to accept these problems as being who the church was. But God's kindness worked in my life, and He has redeemed every part of that, step by step, to where I am now. And I've got to say that this is not a judgmental, law-thumping judge of a God who deals with us. I knew what it was like to follow Jesus. I'd accepted Him, and yet I hadn't followed through. But God didn't let me go. He was there, waiting for me to turn around. Just like that story that we heard with the prodigal father, running to meet me when I started to face him. And I can only say that I'm glad, relieved, I have such gratitude to God that He has worked in my life in this way and has turned everything around and given me a sense of purpose. So, for my decisions about why I do the things I do, I can honestly say I don't decide these things because of the guilt, the shame or regret that I have in my life. Although the things that I've done deserve that guilt and shame and regret. But I can honestly say that I am motivated by God's love because He has shown that to me, and I can respond to it. So today, I am confident in the love that comes from God. And that's my story.